He was called the architect of the Holocaust, a man who turned genocide into paperwork, who orchestrated the trains, the timetables, the machinery of death. Adolf Eichmann. For years after the war, he vanished into the shadows, living under false names while the world tried to rebuild from ashes. Survivors carried his memory like a scar, whispering of the bureaucrat who had condemned millions to die. And then silence. He was gone, untouchable, until one night in Argentina, when a team of secret agents risked everything to track him down, to drag him from hiding, and to deliver him to the only place he truly belonged, a courtroom, facing justice. This is not just the story of Eichmann's crimes. It is the story of a hunt unlike any other, a mission cloaked in secrecy, danger, and moral dilemmas that still echo today. Subscribe now and stay with us as we uncover how Adolf Eichmann was captured and brought to justice. Adolf Eichmann was not the kind of man history usually imagines as a monster. He did not shout fiery speeches from balconies, nor did he storm battlefields with pistol in hand. Instead, he wore a neat uniform, sat behind a desk, and wielded a fountain pen. And yet, with that pen, he sent millions to their deaths. Born in Germany in 1906, Eichmann grew up in a world marked by the collapse of the First World War and the bitterness that followed. He was an unremarkable student, a man of modest means and little ambition. But in the chaos of the 1930s, as the Nazi Party rose, Eichmann found his place. He joined the SS, not out of ideology at first, but for the career it offered. He was efficient, meticulous, eager to climb. These traits would make him indispensable. By 1938, Eichmann had become an expert in what the Nazis called the Jewish question. He studied languages, learned Hebrew, and immersed himself in Jewish culture, not to understand it, but to better dismantle it. When war came, he was promoted into the Reich Main Security Office, where his talent for logistics caught the attention of Heinrich Himmler. The Nazi machine of genocide required more than hatred. It required schedules, calculations, precision. It required someone who could turn murder into administration. That someone was Adolf Eichmann. He masterminded the deportations. From France, from Hungary, from the Netherlands, from Greece, the trains all ran on time because Eichmann made them run on time. He coordinated timetables with railway officials, arranged quotas, and ensured that every transport reached its final destination, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor. His office overflowed with files, charts, and documents, each line a death sentence disguised as a piece of paper. Eichmann visited the camps himself. He witnessed the gas chambers, the piles of corpses, the screams, and he returned to his desk unfazed. Later, at his trial, he would claim he was simply a cog, just following orders. But those who knew his work understood the truth. Eichmann was not merely following orders, he was perfecting them. By 1944, when Hungary fell under German occupation, Eichmann orchestrated one of the swiftest deportations of the war. In just 8 weeks, nearly 440,000 Hungarian Jews were transported to Auschwitz. The efficiency was chilling. The extermination machine had never run so smoothly. Survivors would later remember him as calm, polite even, a man who discussed death as if it were business. But as the war turned against Germany, cracks began to appear. The Reich was crumbling, Allied forces advancing. Eichmann fled Berlin, shifting from one collapsing front to another. He burned documents, erased traces, but he knew that if captured, his name would be synonymous with genocide. He was no mere soldier. He was the bureaucrat of death. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. The war was over, but Adolf Eichmann had no intention of facing trial. He disappeared into the chaos of post-war Europe, slipping past Allied authorities amid the flood of refugees and prisoners. While Nuremberg laid bare the crimes of Göring, Hess, and Kaltenbrunner, Eichmann was already a ghost. The Allies had files, testimonies, even his name. Survivors demanded justice, begged for his capture. But the man who had built the railways of death had vanished into the rubble of a defeated Reich, and so, As the world tried to reckon with the horror of the Holocaust, one of its chief architects walked free. His trail grew cold, and many feared he would never be found again. Yet in the silence of those years, survivors whispered his name, never forgetting. And far away in Israel, a new generation of intelligence officers began to ask, "Where is Adolf Eichmann?" In the ruins of the Third Reich, Adolf Eichmann shed his uniform like a snake discarding its skin. He knew that if the Allies captured him, he would stand in the dock alongside other Nazi leaders, his name carved into history as one of the masterminds of genocide. Instead, he became a ghost. At first, he hid in plain sight. Using false papers, he posed as a low-ranking soldier, just another face among the millions displaced in post-war Europe. The chaos was his shield. Cities lay in rubble, refugee camps overflowed, and occupying forces struggled to separate civilians from war criminals. For a while, Eichmann worked as a laborer in northern Germany, a man of no importance. He spoke little, kept his head down, and survived. But he knew time was running out. Survivors were speaking out. Testimonies poured into Allied offices. His name appeared again and again. The man who signed the orders, who managed the trains, who had stood on the ramp at Auschwitz. The Nuremberg trials made clear that men like Eichmann would be hunted relentlessly, so he prepared his escape. Like many Nazis, he turned to the network later called rat lines, clandestine routes that smuggled war criminals out of Europe, often with the help of sympathizers in the Catholic Church or Red Cross officials willing to look the other way. In 1950, under the alias Ricardo Clement, Eichmann secured passage on a ship bound for Argentina. The voyage was uneventful, but in Eichmann's mind it was a rebirth. When he set foot in Buenos Aires, he was no longer the SS officer who had orchestrated genocide. He was a mechanic, an immigrant, one of thousands fleeing the devastation of Europe. Argentina, under President Juan Perón, was a haven for fugitives. Perón admired aspects of fascism and welcomed Germans who could contribute to his vision of a modern, industrialized nation. Among them were scientists, engineers, and soldiers. Eichmann blended easily into this world. At first, life was modest. He worked odd jobs, lived in humble quarters, and sent for his family once he was established. His wife and children joined him, and soon he had what looked like a normal life. Neighbors knew him as Ricardo, quiet and polite. He fixed machines, tinkered with radios, and walked home each evening like any working man. But beneath the mask, he remained the same Eichmann, the man who had built the railways of death. In Argentina, he even grew comfortable enough to speak freely among fellow exiles. In private gatherings, he defended the Third Reich, insisting he had only carried out orders. Sometimes, fueled by drink, he spoke with chilling pride about his role. These conversations would later prove his undoing. For nearly a decade, the world forgot him. Survivors rebuilt lives. Israel was born from the ashes of the Holocaust, and Cold War tensions shifted global focus away from Nazi fugitives. But not everyone forgot. Nazi hunters like Simon Wiesenthal kept searching, following every rumor, every scrap of evidence. In Israel, the young intelligence service, the Mossad, kept his name on their lists. Then, in the late 1950s, a tip surfaced. A Jewish refugee in Argentina mentioned a German man who lived quietly under the name Ricardo Clement. He had a wife, children, and an accent that betrayed him. The whispers reached Israel, where Mossad operatives began to dig. Could it be true? Could Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust, be living openly in Buenos Aires? The trail, long cold, was beginning to warm. And in the shadows of Argentina, Eichmann had no idea that his years of anonymity were drawing to a dangerous end. The rumor reached Israel like a spark dropped on dry tinder. Adolf Eichmann, alive in Argentina, living under a false name. For Holocaust survivors who had built new lives in the fledgling state, the possibility was electrifying. Justice had been denied for too long. Now perhaps there was a chance to make history answer. The first credible lead came from a German Jewish émigré living in Buenos Aires. His daughter had begun seeing a young man whose father, she was told, was a quiet, unassuming worker named Ricardo Clement. Something about the man unsettled the family. His mannerisms, his clipped German speech, the shadowy way he avoided questions about his past. When pressed, the boy let slip that his father had once been a big man in the war. Alarm bells rang. Word traveled from Argentina to Germany, and then to Simon Wiesenthal, the famed Nazi hunter. Wiesenthal had spent years tracking fugitives, combing through records, listening to whispers. He had long suspected Eichmann was alive. The name Ricardo Clement fit details he already had. In turn, he passed the lead to Israeli intelligence. The Mossad listened carefully. They had heard false trails before, but something about this one felt different. In 1957, the first photos were smuggled out. Grainy, distant images of a man walking to work, of a figure on a modest street in San Fernando, a suburb of Buenos Aires. He wore work clothes, carried a lunch tin, and looked like any middle-aged laborer. But to those who had studied him, there was no mistaking the sloping forehead, the sharp nose, the posture. Could this be Eichmann hiding in plain sight? The Mossad sent operatives to Argentina. Their mission was delicate: confirm the man's identity without alerting him, without sparking suspicion among the community of ex-Nazis who also lived there. They shadowed him discreetly, noting his routines. He boarded the same bus each day, returned home at the same hour. He lived with a wife and children, his modest house surrounded by weeds and half-broken fences. Nothing about his life suggested the architect of mass murder, and yet in small details the truth bled through. His wife still called him Adolf. His papers were suspiciously vague. His stories about his past never quite added up. Most telling of all, when one operative followed him closely, Eichmann instinctively glanced over his shoulder in a way only a fugitive would. Still, Israel's leaders hesitated. To capture Eichmann meant sending agents halfway across the world, violating Argentina's sovereignty and risking an international scandal. If they failed, the mission could expose the young nation to condemnation, or worse. Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion listened to the evidence with grave attention. Survivors wanted justice. History demanded it, but could they dare? In the end, Ben-Gurion made the decision. The Mossad would move forward. If this man is indeed Eichmann, he declared, we must bring him to Jerusalem to stand trial, not just for Israel, but for the entire Jewish people, for history itself. And so, a plan began to take shape, Operation Finale. Elite agents trained in surveillance, abduction, and covert transport were assembled. Each man understood the risks. If caught, they could be imprisoned or killed. But for them, the mission was sacred. To seize Eichmann was to strike at the heart of the greatest crime of the century. Meanwhile, Eichmann himself carried on unaware. He boarded his bus, returned to his humble house, kissed his wife and told his children good night. But shadows lengthened around him. His past was closing in. The trail was no longer cold. It was burning hot, and soon the hunters would move. By 1960, the decision was made. The State of Israel would send its most skilled operatives to capture Adolf Eichmann and bring him to Jerusalem to face justice. The mission was given a name, Operation Finale, for it was to be the closing act of a long and painful chapter in Jewish history. Preparation was everything. Mossad Director Issa Harel handpicked a team of agents with nerves of steel, men who had already proven themselves in dangerous missions across the globe. Among them were Rafi Eitan, a field commander known for his cold precision, Peter Malkin, a master of disguise and surveillance, and several others who would live in Argentina under false identities for weeks, even months if necessary. Each knew that discovery could mean death, not just for them, but for Jews in Argentina who might face retribution from local Nazi sympathizers. Buenos Aires, in 1960, was not an easy place for espionage. Argentina prided itself on sovereignty, and its government would never consent to a foreign team abducting a man from its soil. Eichmann lived in a neighborhood that, while shabby, was surrounded by watchful eyes. Other German expatriates, many of them sympathetic to former Nazis, lived nearby. Any slip could expose the mission. The agents arrived quietly, one by one, slipping into the country on forged passports. They rented safe houses, mapped escape routes, and began a patient surveillance of their target. Eichmann's daily routine was charted with meticulous precision. The bus he took from work, the time he walked home along a dirt road, the way he carried his briefcase. Peter Malkin later described those days as a test of patience and nerves. The team would sit in a parked car, cameras hidden, watching as Eichmann emerged from the bus, trudged down the road, and vanished into his house. Each time the tension built. Would today be the day? Could they take him without alerting the neighbors, without spilling blood, without losing him forever? Weeks of surveillance confirmed what they feared and hoped. Ricardo Clement was indeed Adolf Eichmann. The scar on his head matched wartime photographs. His face, though aged, was unmistakable. The agents knew they had found their man. Now came the most dangerous part, the capture. Timing was critical. Eichmann had to be seized in a place where no one would intervene, where no witnesses could raise alarm. After endless debate, they settled on the stretch of road where he walked from the bus stop to his house. It was secluded enough, but the margin for error was razor-thin. The chosen night was May 11th, 1960. 2 cars waited near the bus stop, engines silent, headlights dark. Inside, the agents' hearts pounded as they rehearsed the plan in whispers. Eichmann's bus was late. Minutes dragged on like hours. Each passing car threatened to expose them. At last, the bus arrived, its doors creaking open. A thin man stepped off carrying a briefcase. It was him. He began the familiar walk home, unaware of the shadows closing in. As he passed the parked cars, Peter Malkin approached. In a swift motion, he lunged, grabbing Eichmann around the shoulders. "Momentito, señor," he muttered in Spanish, pretending to be a local. Eichmann struggled, his briefcase falling to the ground, but the other agents rushed in. They forced him down, covered his mouth, and dragged him into the waiting car. For a moment, silence. The great architect of the Holocaust sat pinned between 2 agents, eyes wide with shock. After 15 years of freedom, Adolf Eichmann was a prisoner again. But the mission was far from over. Now they had to keep him hidden, prepare his secret extraction, and spirit him out of Argentina under the nose of its government. One mistake could undo everything, and time was running out. The capture had been swift, but now came the truly perilous stage, keeping Adolf Eichmann hidden in Buenos Aires until he could be smuggled out of the country. The Mossad team knew that one wrong move could bring the police, or worse, Nazi sympathizers, down upon them. Every hour Eichmann remained in Argentina was a risk. They transported him to a safe house on the outskirts of the city. Inside, he was tied to a bed, his eyes covered with gauze, his hands bound. The agents treated him firmly but not brutally. They fed him, gave him water, and even allowed him to smoke. But they never relaxed their guard. At night, they took turns watching him, pistols always within reach. Eichmann, for his part, seemed resigned. At first, he denied his identity, insisting he was Ricardo Clement, an ordinary worker. But when confronted with details only the real Eichmann could know, his SS rank, the scar on his head, his wartime movements, he fell silent. In that silence, the agents saw acknowledgement. Meanwhile, outside the safe house, Argentina carried on unaware. The streets were loud with tango music and political rallies. Yet inside, history was being held prisoner. The Mossad operatives knew they had only days to act. Israel was preparing to celebrate its independence anniversary, and Prime Minister Ben-Gurion wanted Eichmann in Jerusalem by then. The world would soon learn the truth. The extraction plan was audacious. Eichmann would be disguised as a member of the El Al flight crew, accompanying an Israeli delegation. Dressed in an airline uniform, drugged to keep him docile, he would be smuggled onto the plane under the cover of darkness. To succeed, every checkpoint, every inspection had to be passed without raising suspicion. But the danger was immense. If Argentine authorities discovered the abduction, the mission could collapse in scandal. Worse, Eichmann might slip through their fingers once again. The agents rehearsed the plan endlessly, preparing for every contingency. False papers were forged, uniforms tailored, sedatives prepared. In the safe house, Eichmann began to talk. Perhaps it was the monotony, perhaps the realization that his freedom was over. He spoke with cold detachment about his role in the Holocaust. He described transports, quotas, the machinery of death. What struck the agents most was not fiery fanaticism, but the calm tone of a bureaucrat. He had been, in his own words, a mere functionary. Yet every sentence revealed the truth. This man had never been a passive cog. He had been the engineer of extermination. On May 20th, 1960, the mission reached its climax. Eichmann, dressed in an El Al uniform, was heavily sedated. His captors carried him like a drunken passenger through airport security. Each step was agony. A single suspicious glance from a guard, a single request to show identification, and the mission would collapse. But fortune favored them. The guards glanced at the group, saw nothing unusual, and waved them through. The agents moved quickly, hearts hammering in their chests. Once aboard the plane, Eichmann was strapped into a seat, his head bowed. When the engines roared to life and the aircraft lifted from Argentine soil, a collective breath was released. The impossible had been done. Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust, was no longer a fugitive. He was in Israeli custody, bound for a courtroom that would expose his crimes to the world. Yet the hardest part was still to come. In Jerusalem, he would face justice, not just from judges, but from survivors who carried the weight of 6 million lost voices. On May 22, 1960, Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion stepped before the Knesset and made an announcement that stunned the world. Adolf Eichmann, one of the chief architects of the Holocaust, had been captured and was now in Israel. The news sent shockwaves through Europe, through the Americas, and especially through Argentina, whose government protested angrily at the violation of its sovereignty. Yet beyond politics, one fact was undeniable. Eichmann was alive, and for the first time, a leading orchestrator of genocide would face trial not in a military tribunal, but in the courts of the Jewish people. The world's attention shifted to Jerusalem. Reporters from dozens of nations descended upon the small country. Television crews set up their cameras. For Holocaust survivors, the trial was not only about justice, it was about testimony, memory, and the chance to speak aloud what so many had carried in silence. The courtroom itself was stark, its walls plain, its furniture simple. At the center sat a glass booth, bulletproof, designed to protect the defendant from assassination. Inside it, Eichmann appeared small, almost ordinary. Dressed in a suit and tie, he wore thick glasses, his hair thinning, his posture stiff. He looked less like a monster than an accountant, a man who could vanish into a crowd unnoticed. And yet behind those glasses were the eyes of the man who had sent millions to their deaths. On April 11, 1961, the trial began. The prosecution's case was immense, built from thousands of documents, testimonies, and survivor accounts. Chief Prosecutor Gideon Hausner rose to speak the opening words, words that would be remembered for generations. I am not standing alone. With me are 6 million accusers, but they cannot rise to their feet and point an accusing finger at the man in the dock. Their ashes are scattered to the hills of Auschwitz and the fields of Treblinka. Their graves are spread throughout Europe. Their blood cries out, but their voices are silent. Therefore, I will be their spokesman, and in their name will unfold the terrible indictment. The weight of history hung in the room. Survivor after survivor took the stand. They spoke of deportations, of cattle cars, of selections on the ramps of Auschwitz. They described the stench of burning bodies, the sound of children screaming, the silence of families torn apart. Some broke down in tears. Others trembled as they recalled faces of loved ones lost. The world, watching on live television, heard their voices for the first time. Eichmann listened, occasionally taking notes, sometimes staring into space. His defense was consistent. He had not hated Jews, he insisted. He had merely followed orders. He portrayed himself as a low-ranking official, a cog in a vast machine. He claimed he had no power to alter the course of events, but the documents told another story. Memos signed by Eichmann, transport lists he had overseen, directives he had enforced. Witnesses testified that he had been present at meetings where extermination was discussed openly, that he had spoken with chilling pride about the speed of the Hungarian deportations. The trial was not only about Eichmann as an individual, it became a lesson for the world. The defense of just following orders was exposed as hollow, as a shield for moral cowardice. Philosophers, historians, and journalists debated the meaning of the man in the glass booth. Hannah Arendt, covering the trial, famously coined the phrase, "the banality of evil," suggesting that Eichmann embodied not a demonic figure, but the terrifying normality of bureaucratic mass murder. For months, the trial unfolded. Israel was riveted. Survivors gathered around radios. Families sat before flickering televisions. Children heard for the first time what their parents had endured. In Europe, America, and beyond, millions watched. The Holocaust was no longer an abstract horror. It was personal, human, undeniable. On December 15, 1961, the verdict was delivered. Eichmann was found guilty on all charges: crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes against the Jewish people. The presiding judges declared that his responsibility was boundless, that he had been at the very center of the machinery of extermination. His appeal was rejected. On the night of May 31, 1962, Adolf Eichmann was led to the gallows in Ramla prison. Witnesses reported that he remained calm, offering no remorse, no apology. His final words were defiant, muttering allegiance to Germany and Austria. Moments later, the trapdoor opened and his body fell. His ashes were scattered at sea, beyond Israel's waters, so that no grave would remain for sympathizers to honor. For the survivors who had testified, for the families who had lost everything, the trial brought a measure of closure, but also left an unhealed wound. Justice had been done, but no judgment could bring back the lives stolen, the futures erased. Still, the trial of Adolf Eichmann stood as a turning point. It was the first time the world had seen the Holocaust laid bare in the voices of its victims. It established that obedience was no defense for crimes against humanity, and it set a precedent. There could be no hiding place, no safe exile for those who orchestrated genocide. Today, more than 60 years later, the memory of Eichmann's capture and trial continues to resonate. It is a story not only of one man's guilt, but of a nation's determination to seek justice against all odds. It is a reminder that even in the shadows of history, truth can be pursued and accountability can be won. And so we return to the mission that made it possible: Operation Finale. A handful of brave agents risked everything far from home to bring one man to justice. Their success ensured that Adolf Eichmann would not vanish into obscurity. He would face his accusers, hear their voices, and be judged. Justice at last had spoken. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the importance of memory and vigilance, share your thoughts in the comments below. And subscribe to this channel so that together we can continue to tell the stories of those who cannot speak for themselves. History must be remembered, not only to honor the past, but to protect the future.